Bert Monroy's career as a digital artist began in 1984 following his first encounter with a Macintosh computer. From that time, he's used a variety of software, from early drawing programs like MacPaint and the earliest version of Photoshop, to today's cutting-edge tools to create his art, including hyper-realistic images like Times Square, containing more than 700,000 layers, which is shown in our Make Software Change the World exhibit. Mr. Monroy is the author and co-author of several books, including the official Adobe Photoshop Handbook, a teacher at both San Francisco State and on lynda.com, and a consultant to companies like Apple, Adobe, Pixar, and Disney Animation. Today, Bert will talk with us about his story, his perspective on the evolution of Photoshop, and he'll demonstrate for us some of his digital art practices. So please won't you join me in welcoming to the stage Bert Monroy.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go through, by the way, that book that he mentioned, the official Photoshop Handbook, that was the first book and the only book for almost 2 years, a long time ago. And boy, could I tell you stories about that book. It was only black and white, and we had to fight for the 16 color pages in there, but, well. So that's a piece right there. There's my web site and my email that I usually urge people that if you got problems, feel free to send me an email and tell me what you're faced with, and I'll try to solve it for you. If you do it twice a day, I'm going to charge you. But you know, I try to help people where I can. But that piece right there, it's the first piece that I've ever done that really needs to be seen online. Okay, most of my pieces are like regular paintings. You get a print and you look at it, whereas this one does something very different online. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I'm going to let you go and see it. It's the main screen when you first come into my website, and it's a bit unusual. It took these guys a year to figure out how to do it, but I'll let you see it. People usually like to zoom in to see the details of my pieces. If you zoom in on this, zoom in slowly to see the details, okay? And you'll see what starts to happen. So now, I'm going to go in here, and before we get too deep into this, I'm going to switch gears for a second here. And I'm actually going to do a little slide presentation. I usually don't do these, but they did say I wanted to have me talk about kind of like the history of all this. Now, I'm a traditional artist. I was traditionally trained. I was working with oils, watercolors, pastels, whatever I can get my hands on, piece of chalk, whatever. In 1984, I had an ad agency in New York City. That's how I made my living, by working as an art director, creative director, illustrator, and I always painted on my own. But my partner back in '84 said we had to computerize. And I said, fine, get your computer, but don't expect me to sit there and enter data. But he told me there was a new computer coming out that I'd be able to do my layouts on. So I went down to the computer store and I saw this little thing, the Mac 128. Drew a little box. That was cool. Then I grabbed it and moved it. And wow, that's going to save me a lot on tracing paper. And then I made a mistake. I called the guy over. What happened here? Oh, you went into fat bits. Fat bits? I had zoomed in to the pixel level, and something clicked. This is it. This is the future. Because I always used to shave my brushes and work really big to get a lot of detail, whereas now I could zoom in. So it was only black and white, 9-inch screen, but I felt that this was the future, so I got hooked. That summer of '84, I put out this little product here called Human Forms. It had over 1,000 body parts, as you can see. They had little crosshairs at all the joints, so you would pick this thigh to go with this calf and that foot and this arm and so on to assemble human bodies. They were anatomically correct. That's why the little blue box down there. But all the pieces so that you can build human bodies. Now, strangely enough, the main people who bought this stuff were burn units and hospitals and rescue centers. They were the ones that bought most of my Human Forms. But that was an early thing that I started doing with it. And I started painting with it. This is an early piece that I did in MacPaint. And a lot of fat bits was used into this to get all the detail. And I got to work on a lot of commercial things. I was an illustrator for Macworld and Mac User, and this was a fun thing because it was the first computerized comic book that this guy Mike Sines had come up with, and he asked me to do the background. So on the left, you see the MacPaint drawing that I did in MacPaint, and on the right, you can see how it was applied to the comic book. Mike did the people and the storyline, and I would do the backgrounds and the scenes that the people were occupying. Then came vectors. We saw vectors before with a thing called MacDraw, but Illustrator really made it easier. It gave you a lot more control with Bezier curves and stuff so that you can go in there and create things that were beyond pixels, which was important because now we were starting to see image setters and laser writers which were printing something that was a lot cleaner than a pixel. So we create illustrations like this that were much sharper and could get you better detail, so that some commercial clients started saying, okay, we'll take an illustration done in Illustrator. They didn't care, it was the end result, but they didn't want to see all those pixels. So Illustrator was the first real package to offer powerful vectors that you can start to create illustrations. It wasn't in color yet. Color came later. Around that same time, we saw the first image manipulation program, Image Studio. Image Studio allowed you to take photographs that had been scanned, because scanners were starting to become all over the place, and you could take that photograph and retouch it, and only black and white. Again, remember the computers were only black and white. This was the Mac Plus at this point. It was the current machine when this came out. And then you can spit it out as a VLOX. Now, I see a lot of gray hair out there, so you know what VLOXs are. Whereas today, you say VLOX, what's a VLOX? They don't use those things anymore. But you can spit it directly from your Mac Plus through Image Studio onto a Line Electronic 300 and get camera-ready art ready for printing. This was the first ad for Image Studio, which I got to do the Coliseum, to rebuild it. In fact, I convinced Electra Set to buy Image Studio. I had met these two guys at a Macworld, and they showed me this thing they call gray paint, and I thought it was so cool, and I convinced Electra Set to buy it and put it out to market. Then came color, and that really started changing things. For me, I started having color in my paintings, which is what I really expected to do. And Pixel Paint was one of the first really true packages for painting on the Mac. It was basically MacPaint in color. The resolution was still kind of low, limited size of your files and so on, but you had 256 colors, okay? This piece here was done with Pixel Paint 2, which introduced dithering, which allowed you to create gradients that were a little smoother, so you can really optimize those 256 colors to make them look a little more alive and more realistic. You can still see the pixels, especially on that sign that says Days 5 and 9. You can really see the stair stepping. But you started getting stuff that was a little nicer. No professional people were touching this, but Macworld and Mac User magazines, sure, they were eating this stuff up. So I was doing a lot of work with them using Pixel Paint. And then that changed it all. When this came out, everything changed. The ad agencies all of a sudden started getting rid of those giant machines that were in their basements and putting the Macs right on art directors' desks so that they can go in there and instead of just doing a whole bunch of sketches and stuff, they would actually create pieces that were easy to show to a client and make it easy for that client to understand what they're trying to do in a short amount of time. In fact, I'll give you a quick story. There was one ad agency, because at that point I had gone back to advertising, but now as a consultant and a trainer to convert ad agencies in New York to digital. And I remember there was this guy who was doing this. He was the art director for a company called Unisys, though he was working for an ad agency. That was their client. And he would do about 5 comps a week. The comprehensive is something you show the client, right? He would do about 5. I taught him Illustrator. The first day after he had gotten pretty comfortable with it, he did 51 comps in one day. So things changed dramatically. Some for the good, some for not so good. Like for instance, that's so easy, I'm not going to pay for that. You know, that kind of stuff. So the clients made more changes because they figured they weren't going to have to pay. So there was some downside. But, you know, when it only took you a few hours to do something that would take days, you can tell the client, well, it took me 2 days. It took you 2 hours, but it didn't take you 2 weeks. So you tell them it took you 2 days and you charge them $2 for 2 days. That's cheating, but that's okay. All right. So Photoshop pretty much changed it all. Now I got to see Photoshop early because I got to see everything early. Because way back in '84, the Mac was a toy. Nobody took it seriously. I did, a few others, and we were into it big time. And anybody who was doing something with graphics would send me their product and say, hey, what do you think about this? How should we make it better? What can we do to improve it? How should it work? And so on. And that's how I got to see Photoshop 2 years before Adobe knew it existed, because it got sent to me, and I sat there and played. And my partner at the time was the technical editor of Mac User. So he got to get things also really early. So between the two of us, we would see all these things, and some were good, most were bad, but this guy was really great. And you know that today it's become a verb. So Photoshop's pretty much taken over the market. So let's get out of here. You go back to Photoshop. Now, Photoshop, these are some of the paintings. There's Times Square. These are some of the paintings that I've done. This is an early painting. However, this was a big breakthrough because the computer power had gotten such that I decided to up the size of my files. So this flattened file is 197 megabytes, whereas before they were averaging between 50 and 70 megabytes, whereas the early Photoshop stuff that I did was usually about 1.2 megabytes. And even then, the computer would choke. Whereas now, I was able to do something that would end up being 197 megabytes. And there was a lot more detail I can get. I can come in real close to the light bulb, and you can see the little filaments in there. See? So all the detail was there. Even things that you wouldn't normally see, I was able to put them in there because of the fact that I had all this power and all this resolution to work with. So I did quite a few. Here's another one, Red Truck over here, which was just a lot of fun. But you can go in there and just see the rust and the little bolts and all this stuff going on in there. So these are personal paintings. They're not the commercial. I usually don't show commercial work. But then came this big challenge here, which was Times Square, the one that's downstairs, where I can get into so much detail, like my son who's sitting right here in the front. You can zoom into his eye over here, get real close to his eye, and you can see the reflection of what he's seeing right in there, see? And you can go way up here and see what's going on in those rooms back there, see? So it's something that a camera cannot take, because if you take a camera to Times Square, you're bombarded with light. So buildings in the distance, like that building I just zoomed in, and it's just a bunch of little orange dots, which are the windows. The way, in this particular case, you know, when I go there now, I take pictures with my iPhone. So it doesn't handle night light so well, so usually incandescent lights kind of become orange. Whereas here, I went with the actual way you would see it. You would be able to see the building and its detail by eye, not with the camera. So that's why I'm not really a photorealist. I consider myself a hyperrealist. Photorealism is a genre where they adhere to the photograph, whereas I don't. I try to make the place real so that you're standing there, you can, wherever your eye will focus, whether it's right here, like up here and looking at this little sign, you'll be able to look up there and see the little bolts and the rust and my painting in that office over there and stuff like that. So wherever your eye goes, it's like being there, it'll come into focus. So now I'm going to show you in the short time that I have, and I just noticed that my clock up here is still set to, I was in Malaysia a few weeks ago and I never reset this since I got back. But I obviously don't work on a laptop usually. I got a very short time to show you some things. I'm going to try to cram about 4 months worth of stuff into an hour. Now, the creation of these things does take a lot of steps. The most important thing right off the bat is establishing perspective. Now, in a case like this, even if you took a panorama with photography, one of the most well-known panoramic photographers is sitting right over here, Steve Johnson. Stephen Johnson has the other photograph, or the only photograph in the Photoshop exhibit downstairs. There's a scene of a forest. That's the photographer right there. See? That's him. When you're taking panoramas with your camera or your phone or whatever, there is some distortion. Now, the eye doesn't see that distortion, not the same way that the camera does. So in a thing this wide, okay, there'd be a lot of distortion if I photographed it as a panorama. All those buildings would be curved. So I established a horizon line the way I was traditionally trained. A horizon line with vanishing points and vanishing lines. Here there was some interesting problems because of the fact that Broadway is going at an angle, so the lines going off to the sides are going to be a little different than the ones going up 7th Avenue here, or the ones going down 44th Street. Now, because this is 25 feet wide, it gets a little tough to figure it out here, so I rely on Illustrator. Illustrator is now my pencil on the canvas. Photoshop is the paint, and Illustrator is the pencil. So we go right here into Illustrator, and there is the vector perspective guides for all the elements in Times Square. Now, there are many layers, so everything is in its own layer. They're all in their own layers. But now, you see here, there's the horizon line, a green line, and there's the vanishing points for 7th Avenue and Broadway. But the ones down the street, remember this is 25 feet wide, right? So the ones down the street, see how far out they are? The Mac or Photoshop would not have been able to handle that. But because this is Illustrator and it's vector-based, it's resolution independent. So I can create lines of any size and blow them up to any size, and they will be nice and sharp. So what happens is once I have a particular area selected, like let's say right here, the 1515 Broadway right here, the vectors for that particular part would then be brought into another Illustrator file where I would blow them up to the size that I needed for Photoshop. Those vectors would then be imported into Photoshop, where they would be immediately stroked into a layer called guides, and then those vectors would be used for creating the various elements. So everything in here was first determined. Like for instance here, you see a really complex little part here with a lot of little lines. Okay, I'm going to quit Illustrator, but show you why there's so many lines here, because everything has to be accurate, and those little lines pertain to the Mr. Softy truck. See all the little vents? Those vents have to follow the same perspective, or else even the untrained eye is going to look at it and say, that looks wrong. Okay, so everything has to be perfect. So all these little lines in here were those lines that you saw following the same vanishing point. So that way that this truck will look like it is, in fact, sitting on that street right there. Okay? So now, let's look at the different parts of Photoshop. I use everything in Photoshop. Pretty much everything, okay? Layers, of course, are a very important part of Photoshop. Of course, we didn't see them till Photoshop 3. Anybody here who was using Photoshop before 3? A couple, you remember without layers? Yeah, you really had to make sure that things were right. Because if they weren't right, you couldn't just move it over. You select it and move it over, and then leave a hole, and you have to fill up that hole. Whereas with layers, things were put into independent layers that could be moved around, not affecting the stuff underneath, unless you made it affect the stuff underneath through modes and stuff. But layers were important. Now, I put everything into a layer. Every element goes into a separate layer. Why? Because it makes it easy to adjust them, change them, any changes that are necessary, and it also starts to develop a stock library for myself. Like for instance, there are lampposts, many lampposts all over Times Square. There's a whole bunch of them down here. There's another one here. There's another one there. Another one there. So many light posts. I didn't do a whole bunch of light posts. I did very few. A lot of one-way signs. I didn't do all those one-way signs. I only did one. Okay? So let's go in here and start to look at how these things work. There's a lamppost. I would like this lamppost to have a one-way sign. This one here has a one-way sign. Now let's look at the layers for this pole, okay? You start to get the feeling why there's 750,000 in, okay? See, it goes way down, quite a few. Now I want you to also take into consideration the fact that there's a one-way sign. Notice there's only two layers. One-way edge. That's because the actual one-way sign was not created here. It was created in a file called one-way sign, where it would have the black field, the white arrow, the word one-way, which in one case goes this way, the the other way. Like you see here, there's two different one-ways. And all that stuff had to be handled separately. So that's my stock photo. All right, there's my stock image of a one-way sign, which I can then use everywhere else because it's in individual layers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull this guy out, right there, and I'm going to take the one-way, wait, let's go back into this guy. I pulled the wrong guy out. That's okay, we can pull this guy out too. All right, so now they're both out. And let's get that other guy in view. All right, lamppost 2. So this guy here, I'm going to take the one-way folder here for the one-way signs. I'm going to just drag them right into here, right into there. There it is. So now I can close this down. And let's get this guy full screen. There's my one-way sign. So now I'm going to take it and move it down here. I'm going to take this off and just drag it into position there and put it behind the pole. So now it's going to be behind the pole. Oops, wrong guy moved over. This guy there. There we go. Now it's behind the pole, and I can put it into position. Now, that one-way sign came from the other pole, which was at a different perspective and so on. Let's just say I want to do it in here. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to go in there and distort it. Let's bring this guy up a little bit, more like that, and open it up a little bit so it's kind of coming towards us, just like that. See? There we go. Now, the ambient light here, obviously, is this reddish color. So I'm going to pick that red color. Let's get real close on the sign here. And you see that we have the one-way sign and we have the edge. So what I'm going to do is, let's turn this off. And the edge, I got the transparency locked, so I'm going to fill it with that pink color. Right here. There's the pink color, which matches the one on top. Now I bring this guy back, and I take that sign, the edge, move it over to the left a little, to the right a little bit, and up a little bit. So it follows the perspective of where I've created now. And there you can see that now we have a one-way sign here without having to totally recreate it. In fact, that a lot of the elements from Times Square have found themselves into other places. Like some of the people in Times Square ended up in that Amsterdam scene that you saw before with the fog. Why recreate them, right? In some cases, I've redone them because the techniques have gotten better. But having everything in layers is like a stock photography collection. Okay. So now let's talk about other parts of layers. Like, for instance, layer styles. Now, they play a tremendous role in all this. Let's go in here, and we go layers, into layer styles. And let's open both of these guys here. Okay, here's the phone. It's an iPhone 3G, because that's the current phone at the time in Times Square. And where was it used? Right here on this billboard, right there, see? There's the phone, right there. Now, everything in here, every piece is completely covered. Everything has layer styles applied to it. Now, there's a lot of filters, a lot of layer styles, and one thing I like to stress to all my students is that forget what things are called. They had to give them a name, right? But study what they do. They give you all these controls, and sometimes a little change of color or a change of mode or direction of the light or whatever will totally change what that particular filter or layer style is doing. So look at what it's doing rather than what it's called. Something like motion blur. I've used motion blur easily 10,000 times in my lifetime. And I think I've only used it for motion blur twice. But what it does is it streaks things, which is great for things like reflections in water and so on. It streaks. I use it for creating wood and all kinds of other textures. So motion blur, yeah, it makes what happens when you shoot something that's moving. But what it's doing is it's streaking, so that can be a way to solve some problem you might be faced with. So right here, I'm going to go in here and show you this Corona bottle. See, isn't that beautiful? Okay, let's go see what the Corona bottle looks like. The Corona bottle is right up here in Times Square, see? And those bottles, look, see all the nice little moisture on them? Those are layer styles, believe it or not. Let's go in there and create that. Now here we have all the here's the vectors. There's the bottle, right? And there's a little rim up there and little edges and so on. All the different pieces that went into that. But I'm going to show you a couple of little quick tricks here to create a bottle and to make it look real. So I'm going to go in here and select this bottle shape itself, right? And down here, I'm going to go in there and just say, create a new layer, and it's going to be my bottle. So we'll just say B for bottle. I'm going to pick a color that I want. So I want a nice kind of a amber kind of a color, say about like that, right there. And I go ahead and fill that path, or that layer with that path right there. There we go. So now, I want this to have a nice edge to it. So I go to that layer, and I double click on it to bring up the layer styles. And I need a nice even dark edge all the way around. A dark edge, so you say, well, maybe an inner shadow will do it then, right? There we go, dark edge, but it's only on one side. If I move the distance, see, it's only on one side. I need something that's going to do it all the way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an inner glow, because that gives me a nice even color all the way around. And let's set this to where I was before. Okay. And it's normally, being a glow, this is the normal right there. Screen. Okay. So I'm going to go in here, and right now it's set to white. So I'm going to set it to a really deeper amber, about like this. Click OK. And now it looks like it disappeared. Even though we have the opacity at 100%, let's bring it down a little bit. It's still disappearing. The reason it's disappearing is because, being a glow, the default mode is screen. Anything lighter than those below, display. Anything darker, hide. Okay? I chose a color that's darker than the one that's there, so screen doesn't work. So if I simply change the mode to multiply, which is that of a shadow, there's going to be my dark tone. So I can go in there, and let's bring the size down a little bit. And let's go for the edge right there. And there you can see that I have this nice darker tone. Increase this. And let's move this guy over here so we can see what's going on. And let's bring the chokers down. Let's bring the size up a little bit. And there we got this nice soft kind of an effect right in there. Okay? Now, in fact, we'll make it just a little bigger. Now, you notice that the latest versions have these little pluses, which means I can have more than one stroke. But I can only have one inner glow. I now want a darker edge along this edge right here, something a little bit darker. So I'm going to click OK, and there are many ways of doing the same thing in Photoshop. There are some that will have 3 and 4 different ways of doing the exact same thing. Some things are more efficient than others. One thing that I could do here would be to create another layer exactly like it, give it a layer style, make the fill opacity 0 so I don't see that yellow and orange stuff again and just see that hard edge. But the problem there is I have 2 layers, 2 layer styles. The file starts to get bigger. So to avoid that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that layer with its layer style, and I'm going to come up here to layer and go down to layer style and say create layers. And see what happened? The inner glow became its own separate layer. I can turn it off. Now I can go back into the layer styles again, give it another inner glow. This time we'll pick a much darker color, about like that, even darker, like that, and bring the size way down. So then I have that much darker edge right there, and there you can see that I have a nice continuous tone going across. So it's like a gradient in an inner glow. But I only have I have 2 layers and 1 layer style. So that file is going to stay small. And you might say, big deal. When you have over 1,000 layers in one file, it really makes a difference. Okay, those files start to get really big. So now came those little water droplets, right? So I'm going to just come in close and just do a few. So in a new layer on top of the whole thing, I choose white right here. I'm going to get my paintbrush. And the last thing I did was some clouds. I'm going to go in here and choose the brush, make it smaller. And I'll go into my brush engine, right here, my brush engine. I'm going to give it some spacing. I go into shape dynamics where I'm going to give it a little size jitter so they're not all the same size. And I'm going to go in there and scatter them on both axes, and I'm going to scatter them around like that. So now, I make sure I'm in that layer. And we're going to just call this W for water, okay? And then I'm just going to go in here and draw a couple of these, and my opacity right now is set to 50, so let's bring it up to 100. So I'm just going to draw a bunch of little drops right in here like this. Okay, that's good, good enough. So now, I'm going to go into my layer styles for the water drops. Now I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to give it a drop shadow, because they're going to create a little tiny drop shadow. I'm going to make it much closer, so that it's just directly behind, and the sides bring it down, so it's just a little hint of a shadow under there, real small. And I'm going to bring down the opacity, so it's just a little shadow being caused by a little translucent drop of water, right? Then I'm going to go to the fill opacity. I'm going to go up here to blending options. Now we have two opacities, opacity and fill opacity. Now, if I bring down the opacity, notice that everything went away, right? The fill opacity deals with the original pixels that were created in that layer. Any new pixels, like the drop shadows pixels, are going to be left alone if I bring down the fill opacity. Watch, when I bring down the fill opacity all the way to 0, notice that the shadows remained. But the original pixels disappeared. So I'm going to just bring them down, the fill opacity just about to there. Okay, so it's just a little bit of a glow in there. And then I'm going to give it a bevel and emboss. Bevel and emboss. And it remembers everything that I had before. So let's go to smooth, inner bevel. Okay, good. All right. And let's bring this back to white. The defaults. Okay, we set the defaults. There we go. Everybody's back. So now, I'm going to go in here, and the white can stay. But this black here, this shadow, you're not going to see a shadow there. So I'm going to make that white. Now it disappeared. Why? Because multiply. That's a bevel and emboss. It'll give you a highlight and a shadow, where in this case, that's what I want. I want two different tones, but the other one is in the shadow. So by simply changing this mode here to something like overlay, see what it gave me? A nice lighter tone right around that area here. So I could kind of increase that a little bit, increase this guy a little more, click OK, and I have these nice little water drops, which I could then go in there and do something like take my smudge tool and say that this one is just kind of rolling down here like that, and this one's going like that. You notice that the layer styles are following it, and so on. And this guy over here is just kind of going right up in there. And you can see how the layer styles, with a little manipulation, I made it do exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't rely on bevel and emboss, highlight, shadow. I changed that shadow to give me that highlight at the bottom that I wanted. So that you learn by sitting in there and pushing the buttons. Okay, I co-wrote the first book on Photoshop. I didn't have a book. Didn't have YouTube in those days, right? Like, how do I fix this? Go find one of the 450 movies on YouTube that teach you how to do it, right? Whenever I've got software, I'm the first one that gets it. So there was never a book or anything that I could rely on. So I learned by pushing the buttons. The worst that can happen is the computer will crash. But that's, you know, you just turn it back on and everything's okay. All right, so that gives you an idea of layer styles. Then they have all kinds of masks. Like, for instance, this we have that phone here, right? Well, in that billboard that I had before, let's take the phone. And here's all the pieces down here. This is the composite. And these are all the different pieces down below. See? All the layers that make it up. Those are the apps. And then here's the phone itself with all the pieces that go into it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with that comp up there. When I'm done with everything, this is what I do. This guy's off right now. Okay, I take those guys and I put them all into a single layer. Now here's another very important point. These aren't always documented. The modifier keys, your Command, Option, Shift, Alt, Control, Shift on a PC, those are modifier keys. They will change the way things operate. A lot of the filters, by holding down the Option Alt key, it'll totally change the after effect of that filter. These are things that you pretty much find by mistake, or if you're really looking for things in there. When I get a new thing, I will hold down that Option key and run my finger across the keyboard. Ooh, what was that? And then go back and see what that was. Okay, because that's Easter eggs are found that way. Okay, So I'm going to go in here and merge these guys into one. I'm going to go in there and say merge visible. And you see what happened? Let me undo that. All my layers went away. I want to keep those layers in case I want to change the date on the calendar or something. So I hold down my Option key and say that same command, merge visible. And notice that it created a new layer with all the layers merged into it, leaving all the original layers intact. So that's how I create what I call my comp layer up here. And I turn these all off and see the comp layer. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this guy here and give it an effect very similar to the way all the ads back then were being done by Apple. And that is that they had a kind of a reflection underneath. Back in the earlier days, it was drop shadow. Everything had a drop shadow. Then all of a sudden, everything had a reflection. So I'm going to go in here and create a reflection for this guy. I'm going to duplicate it on itself right behind. The one in back, I'm going to do a flip vertical. And I'll move it down directly below. Now I'm going to bring down the opacity just a little bit because it is a reflection. And now I want that reflection to kind of fade. And that's where a layer mask comes into play. A layer mask uses black to white. Black hides, white exposes, level of gray, level of exposure. So if I give it a mask, automatically makes it white. If I hold down the Option key, automatically makes it black. And I throw in a gradient. So I'm going to go from black to white in the mask, and I throw a little gradient right down here, just like that. And there you can see that it's slowly fading away, giving me the effect that you used to get in all the Apple ads back in that day. Okay? That's a layer mask. Remember that concept, black to white, because in a few minutes we're going to see where that comes into play somewhere else. There's another way of masking, which is what's called the clipping group. Let me show you a clipping group. Right here. I had one for layer mask, but I already did. So I got this little cartoon marquee. This is in Times Square. I'll show you where, well, I mean, it's in there, trust me. Okay. So what I wanted to do with this is I wanted to put this little scene of these little manga characters in there. I created them. I mean, I didn't create them. I illustrated them. Somebody else did the cartoon. So I did them there, and I want them to appear like they are being lit. On this sign is made up of all these little tiny LEDs, right? So I wanted that effect. So let's turn this off and get closer to the sign right here. See the little dots? Let's turn off this part here, and there they are. I just created a pattern of little dots. Now what happens in the case of a clipping group, right here, it's going to look at the active pixels, no matter what their opacity, but the active pixels in the base layer of the clipping mask, and it uses those to mask everything above it. So where there are no pixels, there is no visual. So by Option clicking between these two layers, see, now you're seeing the thing just through those little circles. So when I added the black background, there you can see that now it looks like the sign is, in fact, the way it looks in Times Square, that you're seeing the visual through all these little tiny bulbs. Okay? All right. Gives you an idea of layers, okay? That's a quickie. Now I'm going to talk about something that most people don't even know. Most people at Adobe don't know what to do with them. But the thing called channels, okay? There are 3 channels that make up an RGB file, red, green, and blue, right? They're color channels. There are 4 for CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. There's 3 for lab, your luminance and 2 color channels, and so on. Well, there are additional channels that can be added to a file. Those channels have nothing to do with the file itself, but they're masking channels, and they're called alpha channels. There was a time when you were limited to the number. Now you can have as many as memory will let you. And what they do is they are a way of selecting, a whole new concept for selecting. And let me show you what those do. Okay. I'm going to go in here, and I have a layer here of a tree. See, there's a tree. So I'm going to duplicate that tree right in back of itself. The one in back here, let's turn off the one in front. The one in back, I'm going to lock the transparency and fill it with black. Okay? I'm going to Bring that guy in front again. Take this guy and I'm going to drag him all the way across like that and bring down its opacity just a little bit. So it becomes this shadow, this long shadow from the setting sun. I'm going to unlock the transparency so I can go in there and blur it and do things to it. Now, if you really look at things and how they work, which is how I don't guess at things, I go out and make little models, or I walk around and study reality in order to recreate it. When you look at a shadow like this, as it gets further away, it starts to get stretched out and kind of fuzzy. It also starts to get lighter because it gets affected by ambient light. So we need to affect this area way out here with our blurring effect, and gradually becoming less and less to over here, no effect. So we're going to get the effect with the filter, but we need to apply that filter to a very specific area, and that's where the alpha channel comes in. Where it's black, it's protected. So if I go in here and I select something like this and say, Save Selection, you'll see that when I go look at channels, there it is. See, the area that's selected is white, everything else is black. But you see here that I have another alpha channel where I threw in a gradient. In fact, let's make believe that these don't exist. Let's just start right here. So I want effect out here, so it should be white out in this area, less and less through here, and here it'll be black. So I'll create a channel down here, and I'm going to see the other guys on top. I'm seeing them, and it looks red because that's the quick mask default color. So I'm going to go in there and say white should be here. That's where I want to affect it. Black should be here. So I'm going to create a gradient right in here. Now, anything could be used in this alpha channel. It could be something you selected within the file, or any kind of thing. In this case, I didn't select anything. I'm creating the alpha channel within here. Okay? Then I go back over here. You don't need to see it. I'm going to load it. Command-click on it. And it's showing my marching ants from the 50% gray to the white. So now I can go and use the filter that's going to give me that nice effect, which, as I mentioned before, motion blur. Tree's not moving, but the effect of the shadow, well, there you go. It's a little exaggerated, but I'm going to bring it down so I start getting the effect that I need. See? There we go. See how it's real strong here, becoming less and less and less and less, to over here there's none. Click OK, and that starts to have the right effect. But what about the ambient light thing? This is where the layer mask comes in. So I go back to that, and in that guy, I give it a mask. And I don't want it to totally disappear. I want it to get lighter, so instead of black, I'm going to use a gray, and I'll throw a little gradient right in here. And there's the ambient light, and we have a realistic-looking shadow. Now, channels, it takes a little getting used to, and when you really get ambitious, check this guy out, calculations. Nobody at Adobe knows that. Mark Hamburg used to, well, he still does, but very few people know what this is. But this is a way of manipulating multiple alpha channels to make them work together. I don't have time to show you now. I need a whole day to explain this guy. But just to open your eyes, there's stuff in there that is really powerful. Okay. I'm going to go in here and talk about brushes. Brushes are very important. I'm going to, two more topics I'm going to use. Brushes and filters, because those are the fun ones. Those are the ones that kids love to play with. Brushes and filters. Now, the brush engine here, which was developed back in Photoshop 7, kind of turned Photoshop into a true painting tool for me, because it gave me the kind of power that I needed for going in there and painting. I helped develop that. It turned out the guy who wrote the brush engine was an old friend of mine, because Jerry Harris, one of the two guys who wrote Pixel Paint. And in the process, we did a lot of arguing and stuff to get Adobe to agree to things, but in the end, these three brushes here, those are mine. And I've seen the maple leaf used a lot, but those three brushes are mine. I have about 8 more in here, my azalea brushes in there, all the brushes, but those three made it to the main screen. So it was really great to be able to go in there and start to design brushes. Now I'm going to work with an existing brush first. Actually, well, yeah, let's try to do this. I might go like 3 minutes over into my question and answer period, but here you got this little crochet thing here, right? So I'm going to show you how that was done. Let's go to brushes, is crochet. Okay, in here, let me get a little closer. I have a path right there. This was done in Illustrator because it's easier to do this kind of a thing in Illustrator. They're paths. They're just paths. If I go in there and select them, you can see there, they're just paths. Now, I'm going to create a new layer, which is where I'm going to create the embroidered pattern. Now, I'm going to take white, and I'm going to use an existing brush, a little round brush, okay? In my brush engine, I'm going to modify that brush I did before. Let's turn all these guys off, and bring the spacing down so that they're real close, just touching, like that. See? That's all I'm going to do. It's the only modification. I just made them touch a little bit. So now I come over here, and I'll make them a little smaller. About that size right there. And a tad bigger. Okay? And then in that layer that I created, yep, I'm going to take that path, and I'm in the brush, so I go ahead and stroke it, and there it created all my nice little crochet pattern. See how easy that was? So now let's get a little more complicated. There's a person in Times Square that's wearing a necklace. This is a low-res version of it, so you really can't see it well, but she's way down here. She's wearing this necklace here. Now, you can't really see it in this version, but that necklace is a little chain. And that chain, what I'm going to do is, it has one large link and 3 little links. That's how it looks. Now, instead of having to draw all those, I'm going to make a brush. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a little path to be the large link, and then a small one to be the small link, right? I'm going to take these two. Oops, wrong tool. Okay, take these two and just line them up on the vertical axis. There we go. Then I'm going to take this one. Let's move them over just a little bit. I'm going to duplicate them right there and right there. There's the 3 small links. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this right guy and with black. When you create a brush, the standard way, black is opaque, regardless of the opacity set. Black will make that brush opaque. Anything other than black is going to be transparent based on that value. If you need to keep the colors, then you use the art mixer brush, but this is a standard brush. So I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to go over to this guy, my brush engine, bring the spacing all the way down so that they're solid. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bigger, about like that, and I'm going to go ahead and stroke that. Maybe too thick. Make it a little thinner, and stroke it. Okay. Then I'm going to take these 3 little guys right there, and I'm going to get a much smaller brush and stroke those. There's my brush. So now I can select that and define brush preset. Okay, so now go in there, and let's just send this to white and say goodbye. All right, so now in a layer, right on top of this, and let's get a little closer, I'm going to create a path that's going to be the way this necklace is going to fall. All right, just like that. I'm going to get my paintbrush. There's the thing which right now does this. So I'm going to pick a color that I want. So go with a nice kind of a goldenrod color, about like that. That'll work. Okay, let's make it much smaller. That's a good size, and it does this. So now I'm going to go into the brush engine and modify it. I'm going to give it some more spacing so I can see the distinct shape of the brush, just like that. Very simple modifications I'm going to do. There's a lot of things you can do, right? I'm doing very little here. I'm going to shape dynamics. The angle, I'm not going to change the angle. I'm just going to change the control for the angle. I'm going to set that to direction. See what just happened? Now I'm going to go in there and bring that brushes a little bit closer so you get the link. Click OK. So now I'm in that separate layer. Yep. So I take that path with the brush and stroke it, which I can now go into that little thing here, that little guy, and give it a little bevel and emboss. And let's change this back to, let's go to reset the defaults here. And those are pretty good. Let's make the size a little smaller. So you get just a little thing there, a little more depth right there, and give it a little tiny drop shadow, which will give it a little more distance and have the light coming from this direction. And there you can see you have a little chain. Okay? So now, filters. Filters are a lot of fun. Let me just show you all the people in Times Square were all done piece by piece. Oh, there's a hole up there. Okay. This is my daughter's face. Now, here's the base layer down here. Now, these tones were done with dodging and burning. Here's the original paths. There's the basic paths and the teeth paths. I had separate ones for teeth. Okay? So now, going back to the layers, we'll see that every individual piece was added on top. So here's the eyes. I turned them on. See? And there's many different parts. Okay? If we go down here and just start erasing some, you can see there's the whites of the eyes. Now she's a zombie. There's an iris. There's a texture, you know, and so on and so forth. Going up, and we got we'll do the eyelids, and there's a nose, and there's the mouth with all the different pieces, and there's hair. Now, I did just the face because I needed a lot more detail, so it's a little bigger than I needed. It then went into a file where I did the hair, which was done with a brush, which then went into the overall file where I did the body. Okay? So that's how you get all these things. Now I'm going to basically show you the eye. I'm going to do two things with filters. And I'm going to use the simplest filters that you can find, just so you get a general idea of how these things work. Okay. So I'm going to draw some paths here that are going to be, first let's get the skin tone. These paths will then be the basic eye. So let's just throw tone back there. Okay. And then we'll get the pen tool and we'll draw a little path like so. It's going to be real quick like this. And we'll draw a circle and another circle, which we'll put right inside in the middle. I'm trying to speed this up now. Okay, so now, in a layer, and you name these layers, but I'm not going to right now. I'm going to go in there and select these individual paths. So this one, I'm going to go in there and pick a nice kind of a slightly off-white and fill that path. In the layer, there it is. Okay, take that path, and I got white. And let's go fill it. There we go. This guy here, I'm going to fill with a kind of a light blue like that in a new layer. And we call it blue there. And this guy, the pupil, we'll just switch this back to black and white. And in a new layer, we create the pupil. There they are. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a clipping group right here with that first layer so that we see those guys only inside the white of the eye. They still are individual layers, so I can there move them around, see, but we're only going to see them inside that area, right? So now we're going to start to give this some life. So I'm going to go into the white of the eye and just throw some tone. I'll use a little burn tool. Let's get my burn tool right here. And just throw a little darkness right up in there. Go to the iris and throw a little darkness along the top there, like that. I'm going to go into the layer style for the iris and give it an inner glow. And it's already set to that dark color because I used it before, except I don't want a brown, I want a blue, a nice deep blue. And there it is inside there. Okay, click OK, that's good. And one for the pupil, I'll give it an outer glow. Outer glow, and let's choke it up a little bit so it's a little tighter. There we go. Now we need the texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little selection right inside here, right inside of the iris. And in between those two, I'll create a layer which will automatically be part of the clipping group because it's in between two guys. And in that layer, I'm just going to go ahead and fill that with some white or black, it doesn't matter. I'm going to give it some noise. Add noise, and I'm going to give it a lot of noise, just like that. Let's get closer so we see what's going to happen next. I'm going to give this another filter. I'm going to go in there and give it a radial blur. Except I'm going to set it to zoom mode and stretch it way out. Click OK. So now I'm going to go into my levels in which I'm going to go in there and increase the contrast by bringing those blacks in and bringing those whites up. just like that. Click OK. Now, I want to see it inside the pupil. It's already part of a clipping group, so I can't do another clipping group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the iris into a selection and then give that layer a layer mask based on that selection. Now, I only want the darks to show. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the mode of this layer to multiply. And there you can see we have the texture inside the eye. Then you can add another layer right on top of it and throw a couple of little spots here. Not with that. We'll throw a little spot right in here. We'll make this a little smaller. And throw a little spot, and there's a little highlight, a little one down here. There, and we can bring down the opacity just a little bit, and there we've got the little highlights in the eye. You see? Now I'll do one more because I only got 2 minutes. Let's go here. Create a new one. Create. OK, and let's look at Times Square for a second. A lot of different fabrics. I'm going to go here to John Knoll, one of the 2 guys who wrote Photoshop. He's right here. And down here in his jeans, because a lot of people are wearing denim. In fact, Steven Johnson is wearing denim. Here, you want to see him in Times Square? Yeah, let's go in here and see Steven in Times Square. Yeah. Yeah. There he is, carrying his camera. See, and he's wearing jeans. There he is right there. But let's get in, and my wife is wearing jeans there. But let's go close on these jeans. See the material? It's denim. I did not take a pair of jeans and scan them. No. OK, so let's go to that other file. I'm going to go in here, and let's just pick a color that I want my jeans to be. So I'm going to get a nice kind of a blue like this and fill that layer with that. OK? Then in a new layer right on top of this, I'm going to fill that with a 50% gray, which is the neutral density. OK, used for many different things. Now I'm going to give this guy a filter. So I'm going to go in and put him here. I'm going to give this guy sketch and filter gallery. I'm going to give it a sketch and give it a halftone pattern, and I'm going to set that to line. Okay? Oops. Wait a second. Cancel. Hold on. Cancel here. I'm in the right layer. Yeah. Okay. Let's set this back to black and white and go into filter gallery and sketch, halftone pattern, and set it to line. Okay, there we go. Click OK. Now I'm going to go into another filter, pixelate here, and give it a mezzotint. See how it roughs it up? There we go. So now, let me pull back just a little bit. I'm going to duplicate this layer right on top. There we go. Come on, do it. There we go. And I'm going to take this one and I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees and enlarge it so it fills up the whole thing right there like that. Okay? Click OK. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this one to multiply, or rather soft light. Right here, soft light. And this one goes to multiply. And there's our denim material. See? So it's just filter. And then I added little dodging and burning and little folds and stitches. Let's go back and look at Times Square and look at there, and little stitches and all that stuff. That's a brush. It's a little stitch brush and all that kind of stuff to create the effects of the jeans and a little wear and stuff on it to create the full effect of the jeans. So that kind of starts to give you an idea how there's so many different parts of Photoshop. Utilizing every one of those parts, you can create anything that your mind can come up with.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Was that my water? That's your water.
Yeah, one of these.
Did I have a water?
This may be yours.
I can use that. Thank you.
Great. Well, I thought perhaps I could begin and ask you a few specific questions from listening to your talk, then maybe ask you a general question and then turn it over to everybody else.
Okay.
In looking at the Times Square image and as you were talking through it and taking us into it, I wondered if, I was thinking that, is this an artwork that is perhaps best experienced in Photoshop itself?
Well, that's a good question. Not necessarily. the beauty of this company called Pixar, which on my website allows you to zoom in to Times Square so you can see the reflections in people's eyes and the glasses and stuff like that. So online you can really go in there and see it. A print allows you to, go in there. To see it online, or rather in Photoshop, you better have a pretty powerful computer because it's a really big file. And to have that file, that's a whole nother story.
That was one question that we had from, pardon me, one of our audience members was just how many bits are in Times Square?
Well, the overall file flattened is 6.52 gigabytes.
Wow.
So it's pretty big. The entire folder, working folder, is just under 200 gigabytes.
200 gigabytes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of files in there, a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, little things like like the ice creams here on the side of the Mr. Softy truck, these little guys here. Each one of these is about 8 or 9 layers, and you have to stay organized. So here, let me just show you. When you have that much stuff, it is important to be organized. Really important. So if I go in here to the Times Square folder, Times Square, and I have working, and you see that I have, billboards up 7th Avenue, up Broadway, and all that stuff. They're all there. And the Mr. Softy truck, here's the Mr. Softy truck. So here's the art, these references. And so we'll go in here, and let's just get one of the art AI. Here's the dude. Here's the truck. Here's the side of the truck. Where's the ice creams? I could have sworn I had them in here. I didn't bring everything with me. But, oh wait, here, sign in the window. Here they are. Here we go. So let's pick up pineapple. It's good for today. It's a nice warm day. So here's the pineapple one. And when we go look at it, here's the paths. Okay, here's all the paths. You can see them there. And then when we look at the layers and we start turning off layers, you see that they're all individual pieces and the comp on top. Good old comp. There's the comp. So we go in there, as you see, there's the base. Let's go to background. There's the little base, little tones on it. And I had to try to match the way the sign looks itself. So you can see that I got each piece on top. And then there's, those things are separate. But there you can see that, just that little ice cream thing. Yeah. So it's important to stay organized and once you're organized and you know how to find things, especially with clients. A client says, I want you to change that. And the client's right here. He's had like 6 cups of coffee, and you got to deal with the client. So you got to remember where things are because you can't be searching, So you stay organized, that way you get things done.
Another kind of more specific question is we were remarking on I think it was your maple leaf brush.
Yeah.
It made me think about the connection or the dialogue between the people who make Photoshop and the people who use Photoshop. Do you think there's an unusual connection or collaboration of some kind there compared to maybe other things?
There is. They do listen to their client base, the users. Not always, but most of the time. There were times when they didn't, but they've gotten good at that again, to listening to what people need and what they want and so on. I have different teams visit my studio for a day. Like the 3D team came, the painting team came, different teams will come over and we hang out in my studio for a day talking about everything. But mostly like what should be done, what should be done better and so on, or brainstorming of what we can do in the future. So I do have various teams of different companies that come and visit me and talk about products for the future. So they listen to me, not all the time. I've been asking for folders for paths for years. But their answer is always, only you use that many paths. But they do hear people, and they do have at different conferences and stuff, and at Macs, they listen to what people are saying, what they want, and sometimes they'll get it.
I was also, in thinking about you looking at Photoshop as a painting and your use of it, it is how you paint.
Yes.
As elements to add sort of three-dimensional objects, to work with 3 dimensions in Photoshop, and also you mentioned that video is coming in.
Yeah, well, video's been there for a while. There has been video. It's a timeline. Well, now it's called a timeline. But here, this timeline here is for how you actually create videos with this guy down here. Create video timeline or a frame animation. So once you do that, you can do it based on your layers and stuff and what you do here, you can actually create a thing. And now we have 3D.
Right.
We actually have 3D, which still isn't exactly as it should, but it's getting better. It's gotten much better through the years.
So would this allow you or someone else to, if what you were doing before was painting, does this now allow for people to do like sculpture or film?
Yeah, in both cases, yeah. You can do film, animations. I could do an animation in 3 minutes here that would be normally complex. Let me see, I'll do something for you. Let me open up, I wasn't planning this, so let me think of where I have this. I have it here. I showed it in Malaysia, so I'm going to have it here. I hope. Maybe not. Snow scene, lock. Oh no, I don't have it. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Let's just do a quick search for snow. So the animation is pretty powerful. It does snow-covered street. There we go. Okay. So we have this scene right here. I want to make it snow. Now, this is something that used to be really complex a long time ago, but much easier now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the size of this particular file here. So I go to the image size, and I see it's 900 by 704. So I'm going to create a new file right here, which is going to be, let's go to pixels. Come on, cooperate. Pixels. And it was 900 wide, 704. Okay, so we'll make it 1200 by 1200. Okay, so I'm going to give this noise. Watch how fast this will be. I'll give it add noise, and it's still from before a lot of noise. So now I want to modify this, and right now it's just noise with a sprinkling of gray. In order to modify it, I'm going to add some more grays by blurring it just a little bit, give it a little blur more. So now that I have some more grays in there, see now there's more grays, I can go in there and I'm going to go into my levels, and I'll push all my blacks all the way over to about here and bring my whites to meet them, right about in there like that. And there's snow. See, so now I can take this, copy it and go over to that other file and paste it. And there it is. So now I'm going to make sure that this guy's flush with the bottom. So I'm going to just take him and move him so that he's flush with the bottom right there. Okay? Make that happen. So I'm going to go in here and pull back a little bit. And I'm going to duplicate that one. I'm going to first call it far. I'm going to create another one right here and call it near. Okay? So now, the one that's near, I'm going to make it even bigger. And let's just make it bigger like that. Oh. And then I'm going to do some modifications to it. I'm going to do a 180 and a flip horizontal. Why? Because they're the exact same layer. So as they're moving past each other, they'll go in there and create moire patterns and stuff. So I'll do this little flip horizontal. So now, this is the one that's closer to us, right? So I will give that a motion blur for what it's designed for, motion blur. So I'm going to go straight up and down and go 90. And we'll do a little bit, say about 6. Yeah, that's good. Now, I'm going to change the mode of that to screen so we only see the lights. Take far and change that to screen so we only see the lights. Now I'm going to pull back a little bit and bring up that timeline. Oops, window, timeline. Okay, so there's my 2 objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open them up so I can see that. And what I'm going to do is in the beginning, I'm going to lock the position. It gave me a keyframe. Lock the position of both of them. Now I come to the end over here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my move tool, and I got near. I'm going to move near straight down till it's flush with the top. Then I'm going to move far, grab far, and move far down till it's flush with the top. I got to see it better. All right, let's move far. Are we there? Hold on, I don't have anybody selected yet. Far. I went too far, didn't I? Oh, what happened there? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened, but let's, you know what? Let's just do this. Let's return it to the beginning, and we'll get some kind of a snowfall. And we click play, and we see the snow.
Wow.
Yeah, we only moved one of them. Oh, that's why I went too far down. I only moved one guy two times. But you get the general idea. Yeah, let's go back to the beginning here and lock that transparency, that position. Okay, and let's move it to the end. Okay, and now let's move these guys. Oh, you know what? I totally screwed up because I moved them before. But you get the general idea.
Yes.
Since they're both moving at different speeds, you'll get that sense of depth. So why don't I fix this while you ask the question?
Well, it's very interesting because it's kind of blurring the boundary between what's a painting and what's a film, in a sense.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
something like this. We did have a question that came in through from Facebook that I thought was both interesting and possibly impossible to answer, which was, do you know how many buttons there are in Photoshop? You know, how many things on there that you could click on to do something?
Oh, geez, no, I really don't know.
Yeah.
That I don't know.
And this I thought was a kind of, scaled to you. How many do you use on an average project? That also might not be, your average project may not be average, but...
No, my average project, that second layer got lost in there, but you get the kind of the idea, see? Yeah. But it's snowing. See, there it is, that's where the mistake is, but that's okay.
Thank you.
So much for that.
Well, we talked about how large Times Square is. Here's another question from the audience. How do you not get overwhelmed by all of the options that Photoshop allows?
Because to me, this is a passion.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at it and I say, I wish it could also do this. I would like to then have that. So I would want more stuff in there. Okay, like that 3D needs to be improved dramatically. Okay, because I'm used to working with 3D programs, and there's still a lot of things that are lacking. So I don't get overwhelmed, I get excited. Okay, it's like, to me, I see it as it's like a game. I see Photoshop like a video game, except I'm not killing anybody, I'm creating. There's a difference. So I approach it as a game. So I don't get overwhelmed, I get excited about what's around the next corner. Well, what is this? What does it do? Let's see how many things I could break. So.
What about for people just coming into using it? How do you guide them in terms of approaching the potential complexity?
Well, basically what I just said to you, I tell them to approach it as a game, to see it as something you're going to learn. And the excitement, the payoff is that anything your mind can come up with, there's a way of creating in the Photoshop. So it's just a question of going in there and mastering the tool. It's the same thing with brushes and oils. I mean, you could just do stuff, but unless you really know how to mix the colors properly and so on, there's a learning process that's there. You want to learn. You want to be able to create these things. If not, then why get into Photoshop in the first place?
Right.
If you see it as a chore, if your boss is telling you got to learn it, okay, that's different. But if you really are excited about being creative or fixing your photography, then you have to approach it as this is a tool that's got a lot of potential, and you simply have to sit there and learn it.
Right. Another question about Times Square from our audience. Did you envision or perhaps sketch out the entire Times Square drawing in Illustrator before transporting it into Photoshop, or did you go back and forth between the...
I do, well, if you remember the beginning, I showed the perspective.
Yeah.
I do go back and forth, because if an object is pretty complex or fairly symmetrical, I will rely on Illustrator to create the paths. Because most of the stuff is done with paths. I create shapes, and then I fill them, stroke them, give them gradients or whatever. So I do a lot of the planning in Illustrator, so I'll create the basic shapes and then bring them into Photoshop. But it is just a, thinking of what it is, and everything has to play into it. When I bring something, some kind of shape into something, it has to follow contours and perspective, and I have to keep in mind lighting, the ambient light, the directed light, shadows, is it reflective? All these things have to be taken into account. And there's a way of creating them. If you're working in 3D, it becomes a little easier because you can control the light and so on. But if you're creating a 3D object to put into an existing place, you can't just play around with light. You have to look at the existing light in the real place and try to replicate that light, color and intensity and so on. But there is a way of doing it.
There was another question from our audience about how long it took you to just do, remember at one point you zoomed in on a faraway building showing the detail of the people through their windows.
Yeah.
Their question was how long it took you just to like work on that element of the people living in that building. Maybe an easier question would be how long did it take you to do this overall, the project overall?
Well, the entire painting took 4 years.
Okay.
It took 4 years of time. There was a few months in which my wife was in Chicago helping her sister renovate her house, so I got to go to my old ways of getting up around 9:30, working till about 4 o'clock in the morning, and then going to sleep. And I would make a quick dinner and just sit there and working and and eating. So, because I really get into it, and it's annoying when I get pulled away for some kind of work I have to do or something. Trim a tree or some stupid thing. But to me, this is a passionate thing, so I'm at it all the time. The piece I'm working on now, I've been working on it close to 2 years. It should be done in another month and a half. Wow. It's real close to being finished. So, in fact, are we still running FaceTime Live and all that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Perhaps then I wanted to ask you about a more general question, which you were a working artist using traditional analog art making tools, if you will, and now have become so facile with these digital tools. I was wondering what you saw as one of the most fundamental thing that the digital tools afford, maybe that the analog tools didn't. What's the biggest thing for you about these digital art making?
Well, I would say really the most important thing, undo. Yeah, multiple undos, big time. In the old days, it's like, I airbrush the sky. Oh, that blue's wrong, so I have to go clean the tools. I have to mix new colors. That maintenance took away from the creative process. The beauty of the computer is that you can do things and the results are immediate, okay? And if they're wrong, you can quickly fix them. And if they're, the undos, so go back a few steps and so on and change it. So I would say that's, especially from a commercial standpoint, that's really important, okay? To be able to make changes quickly. So for me, it's like I want to see a blue sky from this blue to this blue, and there's my gradient. I want to make it a little darker, I can. I don't have to mix new colors and wash my paints or wash my brushes or anything. It's immediate. So that's, I would say, undos and the immediacy of what you get is what's the most important thing for me.
And also perhaps it's more experimental in that sense, in that you can, try more things knowing that you can just undo.
Yeah, and the cleanup afterwards. When you say shut down as opposed to now you got to get all these smelly alcohols and all this stuff to clean things and get the paint off of you and the floor. But now it's real neat and clean, except when the lights go out, then it's bad.
I was wondering how you saw the use of Photoshop and art making with Photoshop, the influence or the potentials for this whole discussion about augmented reality and virtual reality. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, Photoshop is an extremely important tool in the world of 3D. I teach at Pixar and Disney animation, and what I teach is the matte painters who do the backgrounds, but the texture matte painters. Because when you do let's say you have a 3D bottle, it's just a series of polygons.
Right.
So then you have to create this skin that gets wrapped onto it, okay? Whether it's cloth or bumps on a dinosaur or whatever. Those are all bump maps, texture maps, luminance maps. Those are all Photoshop files that are then wrapped onto 3D geometries. So Photoshop has a potential for other areas rather than just creating pretty pictures or retouching. It is used for the film industry tremendously for all kinds of basically you're creating, well, there's a company that does scarves and shirts all based on Photoshop files.
Making the textures.
Yeah, all that stuff, and the pictures and the fabric design, everything, it's all done in Photoshop nowadays. In fact, most companies that deal with any kind of graphics, you have to know Photoshop. That's the first thing they ask you. Okay, a long time ago, they didn't care if you used computers or not. Whereas now, do you use Photoshop? And that's the most important question.
So with the same sort of textures and three-dimensional objects, that would clearly translate into this virtual reality.
Because the virtual reality world, you're dealing with a three-dimensional space. Okay, and now you have three-dimensional painting, where you can paint into a three-dimensional space. So it is, in fact, I'm planning on working, once the 3D tools get a little better, on creating an entire art studio that you can walk through with tubes of paint squeezed out with a little, but creating a 3D environment. That is going to rely on Photoshop to create all the texture maps for all these little objects,
right,
to make them look like a wooden table. Otherwise, it's just polygons. But you create a wooden texture and put it on it, and that makes it look like wood. So Photoshop will play a tremendous role in all those things, and they do now. In all 3D things, you're looking at an object. Well, that object wasn't created that way. It's created as a shape, and the way it looks is Photoshop influence.
I liked your comment about having people approach using Photoshop as a game. I imagine, playing off of what you just said, that for video games, Photoshop must also be an essential tool. Could you, I know we're running short of time, maybe you could just give us a few thoughts about that connection.
Again, since you're dealing with a three-dimensional world, even the objects, the creatures themselves, these are all things, all these textures, all these landscapes, they're all created in Photoshop. And then they're applied to this three-dimensional plane, okay? So when you create a 3D object here, let's go in here and just create something very quickly. This will be fine. So I'm going to create, well, I'll tell you what, we'll just create a very simple object. I'll go in here and just fill this with black, right? And then I'm going to say, in that layer, I'm going to go to 3D and say, from that layer, let's make it a cone, a cylinder, or say a wine bottle. There you go, a wine bottle.
I like that that's a preset choice.
Now, it's asking me if you want to change your workspace. No, because I already have the objects that I need right there, so I'm going to say no. Okay, so, and there's a wine bottle, see? So now I can go into this wine bottle. Now, this is an actual three-dimensional wine bottle that I can twirl around and see it from different angles, see, and play with it, and so on. So now I can go in there, and let's say I want to add a label to this. So I'm going to grab this area here, and I go over to my 3D, and this is my label, okay, label material. So I'm going to go into this label material here, and I'm going to go into my properties. And in the properties, I'm going to go in there and say, give me a new texture. And I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to say, I'm going to put a little, let's give it a color. Let's just fill this with a color. Or we'll throw a gradient in. Tell you what, we'll just throw a gradient right in here, like that. Okay? And then right here, I'm going to put in a layer right here, and we'll get a nice red. Click OK, and fill that. And let's switch to this mode here, so I can pull this off here. And then I'm going to save it. Save. Okay, and see it there? There, you can see it in the bottle. So I can move this guy around and put him, let's say I want him a little bigger. So I can just shape him, say maybe a little bigger like this. Click OK, save it, and you can see that it grew there.
Right.
So when I get rid of this, say goodbye, you see that my bottle is now a three-dimensional bottle that I can roll around, see it from different sides and so on. So we can see our label. See? There it is.
Well, Bert, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone who was watching along with me found it equally fascinating. I'm afraid our time has run out.
Minutes.
So won't everybody join me in thanking Bert Monroy?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.